Welcome back to the channel. In today's video we will be seeing, what if Percy Jackson became a god? Please consider liking the video and subscribing.
I do the same thing I told you that I never would. I told you I changed, even when I knew I never could. Know that I can't find nobody else as good as you. I need you to stay.
Shout out to the creator of this fanfic, Phrasing. Disclaimer: I do not own Percy Jackson. Chapter 1, The End? Percy was kneeling on what had been a battlefield until moments before. Riptide lay shattered into innumerable pieces in front of him, the hilt still hung in his numb fingers. The Athena Parthenos stood atop Half-Blood Hill and Gia was defeated, but all Percy felt was echoing emptiness. For him it was a hollow victory. He alone of the seven had survived the battle against the giants. His whole world had come crumbling down around his ears as each pained yell, and every cry of fear echoed in his ears. He had watched his friends fall one after the other until it was just him and Annabeth fighting beside the gods. Even as Poseidon and Percy dealt a killing blow to Polybotes, he heard it, and the sound made his blood run cold. Annabeth's scream of pain, and then nothing more save the sounds of battle. His vision turned red, and he joined the fight against the remaining giants with a ferocity that would have sent a shiver of fear down the spine of any mortal foe. Until the final giant fell, Percy never stopped moving, and even then he stood ready, expecting another blow. Was it not for his father's trident, Apollo may have had to regrow his hand. The god had dropped his hand onto Percy's shoulder, not realizing the state the young man was in. Unfortunately, the fighting was not over. He alone would return to Camp Half-Blood. He alone would face Gia, and if all went well, then maybe he too would take his last breath this day. It was not to be. To storm or fire, the world must fall. An oath to keep with a final breath. As the Argo II plummeted towards the sea, Percy clinging to the mast, Percy remembered the lines of the prophecy. To the world, he spoke what he hoped would be his final words. I will defeat Gia. I swear it on the Styx. Thunder boomed, although Percy could not hear it. The Argo hit the water a mile from shore, and Percy leaped onto the surface of the ocean. A hurricane grew as he ran towards the shore. Already the monsters and demigods nearest the shore were being buffeted by the wind, but the monsters took the brunt. By the time Percy reached the shore, there was not a combatant that could not feel the hurricane. Gia rose to his challenge, but like so many others, hubris would be her downfall. Percy had dragged the ocean with him. When he met Gia in combat, it was in the center of a swirling hurricane. Only then did Gia realize her mistake. Percy and Gia fought, elemental powers wreaking havoc on the landscape around them, but they took no notice. Monsters turned to dust and demigods were tossed sprawling to the earth as they fought. Gia managed to land the first significant blow when a boulder smashed Percy to the ground. Spitting blood, Percy leaped to his feet, the water already beginning to mend his ribs, though they still made it more challenging to breathe than fight. Blow after blow, injury after injury, Percy kept fighting. Eventually, Gia hesitated, her powers weakened from the water that kept her separated from her element. Percy seized the opportunity, and using the wind swirling around him, he vaulted towards Gia. Riptide grasped in both hands as he brought the sword down with one final mighty stroke. The sword cleaved Gia's chest and embedded itself to the hilt in her body. Percy concentrated on the power he had used the least. He was the son of the Earthshaker. He had always been much better at controlling water, so he had never developed this power, but he called upon it now. Using his sword as both anchor and focus, Percy began to shake Gia's earthen body to pieces. The pain grew in Percy's gut as he began to reach his limits. Loosing a bellow of rage, Percy pushed all that remained of his strength into one final burst of power. The final blow shattered his faithful weapon as well as the Earth Goddess's physical form. As she dissolved, so too did the hurricane that Percy was creating. In a handful of seconds the water stopped swirling and the wind died. The world grew silent as a grave, the surviving demigods in awe and grief. They all knew Percy would not have returned alone if the others had survived. Only Nico was brave enough to approach the hunched figure that knelt in the center of the devastation. Percy. Nico's voice was low and exhausted, and he thought that Percy looked about as bad as he felt. Then Percy turned his head, his sea green meeting Nico's dark brown. Before Tartarus, Nico may have recoiled from what he saw, but he understood the desolation and soul-shattering pain. Percy's eyes seemed to scream. They are already in Elysium. I can feel it. The words seemed to strike Percy like a sudden chill, and tears began to gather in the sea-green eyes. All those who remained began to feel a slight tremor through their feet, and the earthquake began to grow. The world around them began to shake more and more violently until many could no longer keep their feet. A flash of golden light nearly blinded the onlookers and the shaking stopped. Poseidon and Apollo stood in full battle regalia, and even as the survivors watched, they shrank until they were human-sized and rushed to Percy's side. Poseidon lifted his son from the ground and Apollo gathered the remains of Riptide. Seeing the onlookers, the two gods stopped, and Poseidon began to speak. Heroes, a great victory has been won, but much has been lost. See to your fallen, tend the wounded, and celebrate your victory. I will see you all rewarded for your valor. Olympus is in your debt once again. He paused in his speech. Much of his energy seemed to leave him. Of the 7, only Perseus remains. The others fell in battle defeating the giants alongside the gods. Ensure their stories are remembered. I leave that to you, nephew. His final works were directed at Nico alone. Nico bowed and then paused. He hoped he wasn't overstepping, but he spoke. Lord Poseidon, I will tell all I know, but I do not know everything. Poseidon looked at Apollo, who nodded his head in response. You will come with us to Olympus, and return in the evening. By then you will know all there is to know. With these words, Poseidon dissolved into ocean spray along with Percy's unconscious body. Apollo stepped forward and offered his hand to Nico, but before he could take it, Will appeared panting. He began berating Nico for his recklessness before he realized who stood only feet away. As he did, he trailed off, face growing red. Apollo only smiled and smiled at his son before taking Nico's shoulder and dissolving into sunlight along with the surprised child of the underworld. Percy was outside the throne room of Olympus despite the grief that tore at his heart, and the exhaustion that still made his bones feel as though they were made of concrete, weighing him down. The door swung open, revealing the throne room and the Olympians sitting on their thrones, but they were silent. Hades sat on the simple throne that was his during the solstice meetings and was looking into the embers of the hearth nut. As Percy stepped over the threshold, the door swung shut behind him, closing without a sound despite their massive size. Percy stood before the council, not even bowing. He could not find it within himself to do even that. He had lost too much in too short of a time. Percy was already bordering on disrespect at the best of times, and Zeus was tempted to punish his insolence. However, as Percy watched his father tap his trident on the ground, the clack of metal on stone echoing painfully in the massive room. As I said after the last war, would any argue that my son is deserving? Not even Ares or Athena dared to voice a complaint against the hero before them. Athena too mourned the loss of Annabeth, and Ares simply hoped that Poseidon would never realize that he had cursed his son when he was 12 years old. Turning now to face Percy, Poseidon began to speak again. Perseus, you have surpassed every hero of the gods. Zeus looked like he was going to protest, but he was silenced by a glare from Poseidon. We offer you a reward. Ask us as you did once before and we shall see it fulfilled if it is within our power. Percy focused on these words. It seemed his father knew what he would ask for as a reward. I think that Hades and Hestia should be on the council. They are both children of Kronos and have as much if not more right to it than others who sit on the council. Percy could not stop his eyes from flicking to Dionysus at these words, as well as Ares. Also I ask that you help the demigods to honor all the gods. Major, minor, all of them. Jason is not alive to keep his promise, so I will do it for him. The council began to debate his requests, some fairly heatedly, but Percy was not listening to them. Either they would do as he asked or they would not, and there was nothing he could do about it. He was only brought out of his reverie by the sound of Zeus' master bolt striking the arm of his throne. Though it pains me to admit it, we would not be sitting here without you and your companions. On behalf of the council, I swear on the river Styx that we will work with the demigods to see that all gods are honored as my son promised. Zeus once again struck the arm of his throne and the room began to shift, growing slightly longer and a space opening amid the line of thrones on either side. From the stones of the floor rose 2 new thrones. Join us, brother, join us, sister. We are now numbered 14. To say he was surprised would be an understatement. Percy was all but floored that they had agreed to his requests with such little resistance. The only thing that confused Percy was that the unadorned throne that Hades had for so long occupied remained in its place. Poseidon once more spoke to the room at large. As expected, my son asks not for himself, only for the benefit of others. I told you that it would be so. Now speaking directly to Percy, Poseidon continued. The council has agreed that you are worthy of one final reward, aside from those you have already asked of us. You have now almost single-handedly saved Olympus from destruction more times than any hero before, and because of this, we believe only one reward will suffice. Perseus Jackson, will you become a god, and become the tie-breaking vote for the Olympian Council? Percy gaped at his father, then looked around the council to see the reactions of all the other gods. Zeus and Hera wore impassive and superior expressions, though Percy was sure that there had been resistance to this idea from them. His father seemed to be glowing with pride, Hades was nodding with approval, and Hestia was smiling as well. Apollo, Hermes, and surprisingly Artemis looked as though they supported the idea, and Percy remembered that Artemis had once referred to him as a worthy man. Demeter seemed to be ambivalent, Athena calculating, Hephaestus serious, and Aphrodite looked sadder than he had ever seen her, though he knew she would not have opposed this idea. Ares wore a wolfish grin, and Percy remembered what he had said the last time he had been offered godhood. Then Percy was dragged into the past to that moment, reliving the meeting that had followed Luke's sacrifice to defeat Kronos. He remembered all the reasons he had chosen to remain mortal, all his ties to life as a human. His friends, Annabeth, his family, a life he wanted to live, and so much more. Then he realized the only thing left on that list that had not been torn from him was his life. As that realization hit, so too did another wave of grief from all he had lost. At that moment Percy made his decision, I accept. Percy knew that there would be much pain, sorrow, and thousands more losses, but if he could save even one hero from the grief he now felt, then it was his responsibility to try. Poseidon nodded and smiled sadly as though he could read Percy's thoughts, or perhaps his father knew him better than he had realized. Very well, let it be so. Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. Zeus' voice boomed through the massive throne room like thunder, and the hair on Percy's neck rose as he felt something he had not felt since he watched the yarn being snipped all those years ago across the highway. The three fates, who had fought alongside them at the Acropolis, stepped into the center of the room now. They carried with them a yarn. This yarn was the same sea green as Percy's eyes, and he knew without a doubt that he looked at the yarn of his fate. The three of them began to chant in a language older than Greek, older than the gods, older than the sea and sky, and as they did so the yarn began to wind itself into a ball between them. When their chanting came to a climax, the ball dropped into the hearth in the center of the hall, and Percy felt as though his veins were filling with fire, his body seemed to be swelling, and he felt as though he would tear it apart from the inside. Just when he was about to lose consciousness, the light died, and he collapsed to the stones of the hall. When he regained his composure, he realized something was different. Even as he pushed himself into a sitting position, he realized he was now tall enough to sit on the throne that sat opposite the rest of the council. Hail Perseus Jackson, god of loyalty, god of weaponry, god of the tides and currents, patron of heroes. The fates listed his domains even as he struggled to breathe. The only thing that truly stood out to him was the final words, patron of heroes. He hoped that meant he would be allowed to aid the demigods that lived now, and would still be. He thought of the words Chiron had once spoken when asked if being an immortal teacher of heroes was boring, terribly depressing at times, but never boring. Easy Perseus. It will take your soul some time to grow used to the changes you have undergone. Poseidon was kneeling next to him and helped him rise to his feet, but as he stood Percy blacked out completely and knew no more. Nico reappeared in camp at noon the day after the battle to defeat Gia, and to say the scene he found was somber would be an understatement. Bodies covered by shrouds were more numerous than was possible to accept with just a moment's notice. Though he was a child of the underworld, even Nico found the scale of death difficult to accept, though he knew their souls would find Elysium, save the cursed few who he knew had driven the Legion into such a frenzy. Nico made his way from Half-Blood Hill down to the big house, where the children of Apollo normally cared for the injured, but there was now a large tent outside that he guessed would hold a field hospital. The Roman design of the tent made sense. The Romans were far more accomplished with this kind of construction, and Nico had never fully appreciated that fact until now. The hospital would have to wait. He needed to find Chiron, because he deserved to be first to hear the story, and first to know the news. It took Nico most of the rest of the day to relate everything to the immortal centaur. When it was nearly the time the campfire was normally held, Nico related the final piece of his story, the ascension of Percy to godhood. Chiron smiled sadly at the news, but there was a light of pride in his eyes that not even the grief he felt could fully put out, because in his opinion there had not been a more deserving hero since ancient times. "Shall we gather the survivors and inform them of this news?" Chiron asked, surprising Nico that he was being asked at all. "I think they need something to celebrate. Besides, we need time before the funerals can begin." What Nico did not say, but he knew all would understand, was that Percy would want to be there for the memorials of all his fallen friends and comrades. Chiron bent his head in recognition and led the way to the dining pavilion, where he took his place at the head table and slammed his right front hoof into the stones 3 times. The sound seemed to roll over the hills. Nico knew that all the survivors would have heard the sound, and understood its meaning. Even so, it took almost 20 minutes for the demigods of Camp Half-Blood as well as the Legion to assemble before the dining pavilion. When Chiron felt all those who could come had done so, he slammed his hoof again 3 times, drawing silence from the crowd. "Heroes. We have lost many, many friends and comrades, but all is not lost. As Lord Poseidon said, you have won a great victory." At this, a roar rose from the crowd and Chiron waited patiently for the sound to die again before continuing. "There is more news as well. No longer are the Olympians numbered 12. There are now 15 who sit on the council. Hades and Hestia have joined their brothers and sisters in their rightful place on the council, and Perseus Jackson has accepted godhood and now sits as the 15th member of the Olympian Council." It was as if the whole crowd was stunned silent for a long moment before a lone voice began to chant from somewhere amongst the legion. "Percy! Percy!" Soon all the demigods had joined in the chant, the valley and forest echoing with the chant of their greatest hero's name. Little did they know that the adoration they gave their hero would allow him to finally awake from his slumber on Mount Olympus. For some reason, he could hear someone calling his name. No, it was more than one person. As Percy began to become conscious of his surroundings once more, he realized he couldn't hear anyone calling his name. It was like a part of him was being pulled somewhat, and from that part, he got the feeling his name was being called. Shaking his head to try to clear it, the feeling kept growing until he felt as though an anchor was trying to drag him off of Olympus. Then he realized it was coming from Camp Half-Blood, and the feeling grew stronger. Now he focused on it and he found himself standing before a crowd of campers and legionaries. Chiron was to his left and seemed as surprised as the rest of the silent crowd. As one, they bowed to him even as Chiron proclaimed, "Welcome, Lord Perseus." Percy blushed and waved his hands frantically at his teacher as well as the assembled crowd. "Don't call me Lord anything, and don't call me Perseus. I'm still just Percy." Even as he said it, he realized that it wasn't true anymore. No matter what he did or said, he was now a god. Not only that he was the patron of heroes, but he was also their protector, advocate, and teacher. "Chiron. Just to let you know, I'm the patron of heroes, but I don't exactly know what that means. Do you have any advice?" Unfortunately, having forgotten his rather larger than average new stature, most of the assembled demigods had heard him. A figure stepped forward, calling his name and asking him a question. "Percy? What are your domains?" It was Nico D'Angelo, which, all things considered, made sense. Willing himself to accept that this was all happening and not a hallucination, Percy turned and replied, "I am the god of loyalty, weapons, the tides and currents. I am the patron of heroes, Perseus, also known as Heroes." At this, Percy's form seemed to flicker slightly. His hair appeared shorter, his eyes harder, and his posture more rigid, his Roman form. "Whoa. Where'd that come from?" "If I had to guess, the fates gifted you knowledge of your name and domains, Perseus." Chiron responded immediately, as though discussing the weather, even as his roughly 15-foot-tall student. Looking over the crowd of demigods, Percy realized at that moment that while it was now his job to ensure these heroes were as prepared as possible to meet their fate, he would outlive them all. He concentrated on shrinking to his normal size, and after a few moments he succeeded in having his size, but for some reason, his body refused to shrink further. "Thank you, Chiron, for everything." The old centaur bowed his head respectfully. "Thank you, Percy." Turning to face the gathered crowd, Chiron raised his voice so they would all hear them, his face once more growing somber. "It is time." No one in the crowd questioned his meaning, and as one they made their way to the battlefield where the shrouded fallen lay on their funeral pyres. When all the survivors had gathered, and torches lit, the eulogies began. Greek demigods were remembered by friends and siblings, Romans by centurions, and fellows of their cohorts. It was nearly dawn when the final embers of the pyres began to burn down. All the demigods save the very youngest had stood vigil by their slain brothers, sisters, and friends. All the while Percy stood on the spot he had finally defeated Gaia. 6 pyres burned before him, each having borne the body of one of the fallen 7. He had lit them himself and let the pain of their loss wash him. Though many demigods had given the fallen heroes their goodbyes and thanks, they left Percy to his vigil. Percy barely noticed the passing hours. The only thing that changed for him was the height of the flames that had consumed his companions, scattering them to the wind. As the sun began to rise, Chiron approached Percy slowly, his horse half skittish and jumpy. "Lord Percy." Percy looked up and met Chiron's sad eyes and saw so many things there, but the sympathy was most prominent. For once Percy simply appreciated that someone else truly did understand what he was feeling. While Chiron had not survived Tartarus, he had lived for thousands of years, watching those he trained and cared for die. Just as he too would remain a part of the world, doing his best to arm the demigods against their doom. He sighed heavily and bent, gathering a fistful of ash from each pyre. He placed it in a small pouch that he would carry until the end of time, or he faded, whichever came first. "Does it ever get any easier?" Chiron stepped forward and looked Percy in the eyes. He knew Percy was not asking if the loss of one's friends got easier, but if over the centuries did it ever get easier to watch those around you die. "No. It never gets easier. I have seen thousands of heroes fall, Percy, and I mourn them all, but I will never stop doing what I do. Because if nothing else, they need me. There will always be a new hero to train, souls to heal, and someone seeking a home." Percy turned to face the sun rising over the Atlantic Ocean, letting the warmth wash over him and burn away at least a small portion of his melancholy. "I just wish my mom and Paul were still alive. I wish that so many people were still alive. I swear to you, Chiron, I will do all I can." The centaur bowed his head as he took his place at Percy's side, his white flanks beginning to gleam in the sunlight. Tap, tap, clang, tap, tap, clang. The pattern of hammer blows repeated, again and again, echoing from the forge of Hephaestus Undermount Street, Helens. He had rebuilt it after the incident Perseus had caused, and so he thought it fitting that here he would reforge the shards of riptide into a weapon befitting the god of weaponry. Even with his prodigious skill, it took him nearly a day to complete the sword to his satisfaction. Before him lay a bronze ring on his anvil. Tiny Greek letters read, "A riptide is most dangerous at dusk." Hephaestus had sensed immediately the connection to the seed that had been wrought into the blade, and from what he had learned by speaking with Poseidon, it had once belonged to the Hesperide, Zoe Nightshade. He thought that the inscription suitably honored its origin, and he refused to change the name or anything about the original design, as this was not a pet project. Picking up the ring, he spun it around his finger and the sword leaped into being just as it would have before. The bronze blade gleamed with a new brilliance as during the reforging process he had added some moon steel, with Artemis' permission of course. Another way to pay homage to the weapon's original creator. Would he have designed the sword exactly as it was? Likely not, but this sword had felled some of the most legendary monsters in history. Giants, titans, gods, and even Gaia herself. No, this sword was perfect the way it was, and he hoped Perseus would agree. Snapping his fingers, Hephaestus reappeared on Olympus. He found Poseidon in the throne room watching Percy through an iris message. Foregoing simple pleasantries as was his way, Hephaestus held out the ring to Poseidon. Then he too turned to look at the image hanging in the air before them. Percy and Chiron stood looking out at the sunrise, yet even as the two Olympians watched the pair, the centaur and new god turned back towards camp. "He has done well," Hephaestus' words seemed to take a long time to reach Poseidon, who was still watching his son. After another moment Poseidon waved a hand through the image, cutting off the connection. Only then did he turn to Hephaestus. "Thank you. I'm surprised to hear you say that after he destroyed your forge." Hephaestus waved a hand dismissively. "I like a challenge. Rebuilding my forge gave me one. More importantly, however, I have a feeling about him. Maybe it's just his domain of weaponry, or maybe it's something else. I think he is going to be good for us. Be sure you get him that ring, he should be quite pleased with it." Poseidon inspected the ring more closely. He had felt a faint connection to the sea from it, but now he realized it must be riptide. He spun it around in his hand and he found himself holding the reforged sword. "I'm glad to have been helpful to you. What have you changed?" Poseidon held the sword before himself, feeling the balance and the way the sword moved through the air. It felt like an extension of his arm, and he knew Percy would be pleased to have his sword back. "It is now made of an alloy of the original celestial bronze and moon steel. Other than that, I did my best to change as little as possible. The best weapon is one you are familiar with and can wield instinctively. Besides, from what you told me, the sword's original creator deserves to be remembered. For a nymph, she created a beautiful weapon." Poseidon raised an eyebrow at these words, looking slightly surprised, and re-examined the sword. "Moon steel? I assume you talked with Artemis? Has she ever permitted a man to carry a weapon made out of it before?" Hephaestus shook his head but then seemed to reconsider for a moment. "Her brother may have at one time or another carried one, but other than Apollo I cannot think of another. Well, Perseus has always enjoyed defying expectations. Thank you, Hephaestus, I am in your debt for aiding my house once again." Percy tensed. He couldn't explain it, but there was suddenly a sensation like pressure or a faint vibration. Moments later a flash of light filled Poseidon's cabin, and when it faded it revealed Poseidon himself. "Hello, father." Percy bowed his head slightly, but Poseidon noted the tone of loss in his voice. Stepping forward, Poseidon embraced him. "When you are ready, there is much to be done and things to be decided. Until then, however, Hephaestus sends his regards and a gift." Looking up at his father, he felt a slight twinge of unease flit through him. Hephaestus' creations had a way of getting into trouble of all sorts. To his surprise, however, the ring his father held out appeared entirely innocuous. "Place it on whichever finger you wish. That is a new and improved riptide. I believe you will find it more than satisfactory." Percy slid the ring onto his right-hand index finger after reading the inscription. The words seemed to echo within him for a long moment as he was once again reminded of his failure to save Zoe. He spun the ring and found a very familiar sword in his hand. He swung it experimentally a few times, marveling at how similar it felt to the original. The only difference he could detect was the slighter grayer hue of the metal. "I will have to thank him for this. Why is it kinda gray now though?" Hephaestus alloyed the remains of the original sword with moon steel. A rare honor, as Artemis has never allowed any male, save her brother possibly, to wield a weapon made of that material. Percy looked at his father surprised. "What is moon steel, and why would she?" "That you will have to ask her yourself. Remember, despite the age difference, you are a god now and a member of the Olympian Council. You have no reason to fear her. Well, not no reason, but no more reason than any other god. Besides, it seems like she respects you more than most men. Take it as a compliment." Percy spun the sword in his hand, willing it to shrink, and it transformed back into the ring that reappeared on his finger. Percy was unsure how to react, though he supposed having a goddess well known for hating most men on his side definitely couldn't hurt. Unfortunately for Percy, that thought brought reality crashing back down. Zoe, Selena, Beckendorf, Lee, Luke, Frank, Hazel, Leo, Piper, Jason, Annabeth. He had failed to save so many people. Why did he get to live? Not just live, he was a god now and he couldn't save his friends. If he had been destined for godhood, why had he not been stronger? Why hadn't he been able to save them? Percy. Not even we can change the past. Look forward and do the best you can for all the heroes who still live. Just maybe you can change things for the better. Now let us return to Olympus. You have things you need to do sooner than later." Percy stood and stepped toward his father, who grabbed his shoulder. Percy found himself standing on a balcony overlooking the city of Olympus. The view was incredible, though it was marred by the heaviness that overtook his heart. Annabeth had designed so much of the city that looking out over it sent pangs of grief through his heart. A strong arm guided him into the building and Percy found himself in Poseidon's palace on Mount Olympus. So what do I have to do exactly? You will have many tasks, but for now let us focus on the simplest. Choosing your godly symbols and such things. For example, mine is my trident. Percy didn't even have to consider it. My sword. Riptide. Poseidon nodded, unsurprised at the speed of his answer. Very well. Take the sword in your hands. Wet the blade with your ichor and concentrate on imbuing the sword with your very essence, linking it with your power. Percy did as his father instructed, hissing in pain slightly as he cut his forearm. As he began to concentrate on the sword, he felt as though the sword was drinking his energy, absorbing it, until there was a flare of sea green light. Very good. You're a natural at controlling your powers. Now for your sacred animal, do you have anything in mind? Again Percy's reaction was nearly instantaneous. Blackjack. My Pegasus. Percy whistled as loudly as he could, and after only a minute or two, there was the sound of wings, followed shortly by hooves striking stone floors. Percy threw open the doors to the balcony, revealing Blackjack. Hooah. Good to see ya, boss. You smell different. Do you have donuts? Despite himself, Percy laughed and hugged the Pegasus. It's good to see you too, Blackjack. I don't have any donuts, but I do have some news. Well, I became a god and I want you to be my sacred animal. Blackjack sniffed him, then snorted as horses tend to do. You smelled different. Course I'll be your sacred animal. Wait, what does that involve, boss? No idea. Let's ask my father. It seemed Blackjack only now noticed Poseidon standing a few feet away. Percy laughed as Blackjack looked around nervously. Yo, boss man. Why didn't you warn me the ocean dude was here? It seemed like Blackjack was mentally whispering, which Percy found highly entertaining. Even more so when his father spoke. Well met, Blackjack. I've gotta say I don't remember being called the ocean dude before. Being a sacred animal is quite simple. Percy will bless you and link you to his power. You will then be an immortal, just as he is, to be by his side until the end. Immortal? Dope. But does it involve donuts? I want some donuts, boss. Both Percy and Poseidon laughed at that, the latter snapping his fingers, a box of donuts appearing in his outstretched hand. Blackjack looked at the box, then at Percy, then back to the box. Hey, boss. What in the world could that be? Blackjack all but galloped at Poseidon, eagerly enjoying the donuts. Percy and Poseidon just kept laughing, and it was a real laugh they shared. All too soon memories of recent events crept in, and the smile slowly fell from Percy's face as he remembered those who could no longer laugh alongside him. Percy and Blackjack, with Poseidon's help, sealed their bond, and in the blink of an eye he grew hands higher at the shoulder, and his wings were now edged with a deep blue-green color on the tips of his feathers. So subtle it was only visible in direct sunlight, it made his wings almost ethereal in appearance. Wow, boss. Snazzy new feathers, huh? I'm gonna go find some ladies. I mean, go try out my new wings. With that, Blackjack took to the sky, and with only 3 powerful flaps of his wings, he was gone from sight. Percy turned to his father, who stood with his back to the open doors but slightly to the side. Symbol is set and my sacred animal was chosen. Is that all, or is there more we need to do? Percy was curious, but he was also tired, though tired wasn't the right word for what he was feeling. Drained would be a much better way to describe how he was feeling, Percy thought. Drained. Well, that depends. First I would like to discuss your sword. My sword. Yes. I want you to understand the significance of moon steel. It is an alloy of mortal steel and silver that has been consecrated in a sacred stream that only Artemis and her hunters know the location of. It is even more important now than ever that you remember your powers and weapons are not to be used lightly. That sword will now harm mortals, and immortals alike, but more than that, the fact that Artemis gave Hephaestus moon steel to alloy with your sword means she felt you were worthy. Not something many men, mortal or immortal, can claim. Percy felt his cheeks grow slightly warm at the praise. I'm not that special. I just did what anyone would do. A new voice sounded behind him. The speaker moved behind him with alarming stealth. "That is where you are wrong, Perseus." Percy whipped around in surprise and took a half step back. "Hello, Lady Artemis. Thank you, though I'm not sure if I agree." Artemis waved a hand dismissively, walking past Percy towards the balcony overlooking the city. Only then did Percy notice his father had disappeared, which seemed odd to Percy. "Look at the stars, Perseus. What do you see?" "I see the stars, my lady. Amongst them are constellations and the moon. Though why can we see the stars? Isn't it mid-morning?" Artemis shot him a glance that seemed equal parts annoyed and impressed. "You truly are a unique person, Perseus Jackson. We are gods. Why would we not see that which we desire to see?" Artemis stared at him for a moment, examining his reaction before continuing to speak. "I see constellations as well. However, I speak of one in particular, the Huntress. You watched me place her among the stars, and she created the sword whose successor you now wield. Will you give it to me?" Without hesitation, Percy spun the ring and laid the sword flat on his palms, offering it hilt first to the goddess. Artemis, however, did not move to take it. Instead, she examined it closely before returning her gaze to the sky. "I am impressed you were so willing to relinquish your symbol of power. Do guard it better in the future, as losing it now would mean a loss of much power, just as losing his trident would be a heavy loss for your father. It is a magnificent weapon, and I believe Zoe would approve of the changes wrought by the smith." Percy bowed his head slightly in response, returning the sword to ring form at the same time. Now Percy too examined the stars, his eyes tracing the Huntress again and again. Once again Bob's words echoed to him from his memories, and a single tear escaped his eye, slowly running down his face. He told the stars hello again for Bob, his lost friend. "Perseus, you did what I could not in thousands of years. You healed her heart. For so long she labored under the wounds dealt by her father, sisters, and the swine. You earned her trust and her respect, and I cannot thank you enough for that." Artemis turned and saw the singular tear tracing down his cheek and cocked her head slightly. "Why do you cry?" Percy dashed the tear from his face before replying, blinking several times to clear his eyes. "For those I have lost. This one," he gestured to his face, "was for a friend named Bob. He asked me to tell the stars hello for him. Right before we escaped Tartarus. We only got out because he and Damazon sacrificed themselves for us." Artemis looked at him. Her eyes remained entirely unreadable to him. The silver of her irises seemed to shimmer strangely. "Sometimes it can become easy for us to grow apart from the humans. Somehow I do not believe this is something you will have to deal with. There are times when I lose a hunter. Times when I lose a hunter and it is like losing a part of myself, but I don't think I can truly understand what you have been through. Though I am sorry for your losses." Percy looked away from the goddess as she spoke, once more gazing upon the Huntress. He took a long while to organize his thoughts even after Artemis had finished speaking. "Thank you, my lady. Thank you for everything." She acknowledged his thanks, and with barely a sound she turned and disappeared to only she knew where, leaving Percy on the balcony looking at the now clear blue sky. Though not for long, it seemed as if there were two flashes of light, one on either side of Percy. Apollo and Hermes stood on either side of him looking out at the city as well. "So how is it so far?" Apollo asked in a very uncharacteristically serious voice. It surprised Percy, who had only known the god to be energetic and positive, even when his sister was missing. "Being a god? I don't know yet. It's kind of hard to say." Both Hermes and Apollo were nodding as though they had expected that answer. This time Hermes spoke and Percy turned to face him. "Well, we are going to help you get acquainted with your new life, your new powers, and just maybe help you with more than that." Percy looked at him slightly confused, not understanding what he meant. The look of confusion was easy to read for Hermes. He smiled sadly. "Percy, Apollo is the god of medicine and healing. I still owe you for everything you did for Luke. I'm not saying we can take your pain away, but having someone to talk to is very helpful. If you don't want to talk to us, we understand, but talk to someone." Percy was seeing an entirely new side of both gods, though now that he thought about it, they were both thousands of years old. They had likely lost more than he could even imagine in his worst nightmares. "Thank you. I think I could do that." But for now, can we focus on something else? I want to. No, I need to do something useful. The other two gods nodded, seemingly unsurprised by this request. There's only one condition for our help. Hermes appeared deadly serious as he said this, and Percy grew slightly nervous. Apollo finished for him. Don't go blabbing about this to anyone. Wouldn't want everyone to realize we aren't just upbeat all the time. Percy smiled sadly and nodded in agreement. Time began to fly by for Percy as Apollo and Hermes began to teach him everything he needed to know about being a god. They also helped him explore his powers, which proved to be an interesting task as they told him he would likely develop more powers as his connection to his domains began to develop and grow. As of now, the only power he had figured out was linked to the domain of weaponry. He was able to summon weapons into being on command, though only weapons he had seen before or was otherwise familiar with. Hermes theorized that this was because his mind needed a structure or focus for his power. It seemed a logical explanation to Percy, so he just practiced his abilities. His connection to the ocean was greater as well, his hydrokinetic abilities had been increased, and he felt as though he could feel the shifting currents and tides easier than before. Almost a month had passed since Percy had finally chosen to become a god, and in that time much had happened to him. He had learned how to use most of his generic godly powers, teleportation, and shape-changing to name his favorites. Percy loved being able to change his appearance. It meant he was able to walk amongst the demigods, both Roman and Greek, without drawing the normal attention he would have. He maintained his natural appearance. He did what he could for the two groups of demigods while trying to maintain his anonymity. It didn't always work, especially if he saved demigods from monster attacks. His fighting style and his ability to stand against any monster without breaking a sweat set him apart immediately. Percy had also figured out how to split himself into multiple streams of consciousness. He maintained a presence at the borders of both camps, serving as a final unseen line of defense, though his mastery left something to be desired. He could only maintain singular points of focus, meaning that essentially there were just 3 of him in the world. 2 patrolling invisibly along the borders of Camp Half-Blood and Camp Jupiter, while his main consciousness was elsewhere. Percy had kept himself moving and busy for as many hours of the day as he possibly could, refusing to face the demons hiding in the recesses of his mind. Apollo and Hermes did their best to try to get him to open up, but he rebuffed their attempts. That is until Athena let him know his palace was complete, and that he should give it a look. Palace? What palace? Whipping around, he glared at Apollo and Hermes. What did you do? Both gods simply smiled at him, complete innocence on their faces. He knew he would get nothing out of the man, so resigned himself to his fate. He followed Athena through the city to a low building that was set apart from most of the other palaces. For a long while, Percy simply gaped. Built half on and half of a small lake, the building was easily twice the size of the Poseidon cabin, but compared to the other palaces it was tiny. I know the movie was terrible, but the Poseidon cabin in the movie is serving as the inspiration for the aesthetics of this. The wooden beams that sank into the ground to support the cabin looked as though they were made of some sort of incredibly dark, heavy wood. The same material made up the frame of the building, but the walls were different. The wood was much lighter looking and was painted a beautiful blue-green color. Percy stepped forward and opened the front door, revealing a sizable main room with 4 doors and 2 sets of steep stairs up to a second level that was open to this main room in the center. He opened one of the rear doors and stepped out onto a back porch that sat above the water. You can change the view to any coastline in the world if you wish. Percy almost jumped in surprise at hearing Athena's voice. Having a better idea of his powers now, he willed the location to change and the world blurred. He was looking out at the view from the cabin his mom had taken him to at Montauk. Percy willed the view to return to Olympus, and it did. Thank you, Lady Athena. This is amazing. Athena met his eyes and examined him for a long moment. My daughter's passing still weighs heavily upon you, as do your other friends? Or am I mistaken? Percy clenched his jaw and turned to look out over the water, trying to rein in his emotions. A hand gripped his shoulder, turning him to face Athena. I did not appreciate or approve of you courting my daughter. At least I didn't at first. After watching you struggle to regain the memories Hera stole from you, I could not in good conscience maintain my disapproval. Did you know Hera tried to take your memories of my daughter as well? Your mind refused to let them go. That is why you were not given false memories of a new life like Jason. Such devotion to my daughter could not be ignored. I do not blame you for her death, you should not blame yourself. Percy felt the tears running down his face dry somewhat as Athena erupted in a column of flame, just as she had done to him once before. Fresh tears replaced them and Percy sank to the floor beneath him, legs dangling off the edge of the porch. It was not long before Apollo and Hermes came looking for him. Both of them sank to the edge of the porch as he had. They didn't say anything, which Percy appreciated. After what felt like hours, Percy finally found words. I lost everything. When we escaped Tartarus, I thought just maybe there was a chance we could get through everything. They didn't even allow me that victory. I had to watch my mom and stepdad be murdered again and again in my dreams. Then the final battle came and only I survived. Apollo and Hermes were both silent and still, listening to his words, and not interrupting. A flash of light lit the sky and both gods groaned in annoyance. Percy looked at them both in turn. Dad's calling an emergency meeting, Apollo stated dryly. But before we go, I am sorry about your mom and stepdad. I didn't know you had lost them as well. The light flashed again, and both Hermes and Apollo paled slightly. We better go fast. The last time he signaled more than once was when Typhon escaped his prison. Percy gaped at Apollo's words, following the advice and flashing to his throne immediately. Apollo had been right. Updated March 17, 2023, added ocean currents to Percy's domains because while planning things going forward it felt like a necessary change. Well, it's a start. I haven't figured out if I want Percy to have a romantic interest in this story yet. Almost none of the common choices feel right, and to be perfectly honest, I have never been a huge fan of Percabeth. Also, obviously she's not exactly an option. I plan on this being a decent length story, so I suppose as the story evolves I will have to see if any relationships seem to make sense. Also, I plan on this being updated roughly once a month as I am currently working on 2 stories at the same time, and I want to be better about readability and all that jazz. Chapter 2, Fate Never Lets Up. I know I said this would only be once a month, but I had some time and inspiration, so I figured it would be better to not waste it while I had it. There were 2 reviews on the first chapter, Lost Xinxfex Darkness and Kilescha Chaos. Thank you both for the long reviews. I've been thinking about them both quite a bit. Calypso feels like the best fit to me at the moment because her story was already planned to be a detail changed as a part of my story due to the rest of the 7 being dead in my story. Also, while I think a goddess from another pantheon is a very interesting concept, I plan on this being a Greek pantheon-only story, at least where the main characters and relationships are concerned. Bit of a warning for this chapter. While not overly graphic, there is a more detailed description of the battle where the 6 members of the 7 fall, as well as a section about Sally and Paul's deaths. Again, it is not overly graphic, but it touches on some topics I know are sensitive for some. The sections in question are in italics. Chapter 2, Fate Never Lets Up. Percy couldn't get even a summer off after becoming a god. No, the fates, Anak or someone just had it out for him. Still, Percy appeared on his throne only seconds after Apollo and Hermes, but unlike them, he appeared about 6 feet too high. He fell heavily to his still unadorned throne in a very undignified manner. Picking himself up, Percy realized he was still human-sized and must have looked ridiculous compared to his massive throne. Willing himself to grow, he adjusted himself so he was actually sitting on his throne, doing his best to not fidget, feeling like he was in the principal's office at one of his many schools. Despite Zeus' stony expression and the seriousness of the situation, it appeared both Apollo and Hermes were struggling to maintain straight faces. Even Poseidon seemed to be holding back a smile. If you're done distracting the council. Zeus paused dramatically, staring thunderously at Percy before continuing, something must be done. This war almost led to Olympus in ruin. Apollo, your actions have nearly led to our destruction. Zeus' anger billowed like thunderheads, the very air crackling with energy around them. Percy was glad to see it wasn't only him that was confused by this statement. In fact, everyone besides Zeus, Hera, and Athena looked utterly perplexed. You granted the usurper the gift of prophecy. He was your legacy. Had Octavian had his way, Olympus would now lie in ruins. Apollo had begun to bristle at the initial accusations, but he seemed to shrink when Zeus said Octavian's name. He cast his eyes downwards, avoiding his father's gaze. Percy looked around at the council to see if anyone was going to step in and defend Apollo. Percy was about to say something when he met his father's gaze. To his surprise, Poseidon shook his head almost imperceptibly and Percy was stunned. His father wanted him to sit by and do nothing? Then Percy looked at Zeus again, and saw the combination of rage and fear. Percy wasn't sure he understood everything, but he knew he had to keep silent lest he incurs the Sky Lord's wrath himself. Zeus didn't stop there, however. Pointing his master bolt at Apollo, he began to chant in ancient Greek. Percy had been all right at understanding the language when he was mortal, but now elevated to godhood he understood perfectly. What he was hearing was a spell of sealing, of limiting, the containment of power, and the limitations of the flesh. To the council's amazement, within moments where once had been Apollo now sat a smallish and average-looking human of at most 15. It seemed this was more than Artemis could take without complaint, however. "Father? What have you done to my brother?" "Silence, daughter, or you will join him in his punishment. Apollo, you are sentenced to 9 years as a human, or until you earn my forgiveness. Is that clear?" Both Apollo and Artemis looked at their father with dumbstruck faces. The other gods had more schooled expressions, save Percy. He was sure his face was as shocked as either of the twins. Zeus then detailed Apollo's mortal name as well as what he was allowed to tell and to whom. Artemis had once more found her voice, anger now coloring her words far more than Percy had ever heard save when she was speaking to Atlas. "Father, if he is to do what I think you intend, he will die. Only a god." Zeus silenced her with a withering look. It was the first time that he had seen Artemis cowed by anything. Percy found he was once again gritting his teeth to once again stop himself from interrupting and making the situation worse for all involved. Zeus cleared his throat and seemed to be working to suppress his anger, at least partially, when he spoke next. "Of course, by himself, you are correct, daughter. The task which he will find himself attempting to complete on his own would certainly kill him." His face darkened as he spoke, and after a short pause, he raised his eyes to meet his daughter's eyes. "I will ensure he will not be slain. That much I will promise." Before Artemis could reply to this, Zeus struck his bolt on the arm of his throne. "Dismissed. This meeting is concluded. Perseus, stay." Poseidon's head whipped around at these words, his eyes briefly showing alarm before he hid the expression. He retook his seat, looking pointedly at his brother. The message was clear. "My son stays, so do I." Zeus either didn't care or knew that arguing would only make the situation more tenuous than it was, so he said nothing. Percy had never known Zeus to willingly choose the sensible option, so was immediately on guard. Eventually, the other gods made their way out of the throne room, some flashing away, others walking out of the main doors and disappearing from their sight. Once all that remained in the hall were Zeus, Poseidon, and Percy. The king of the gods stood and shrunk to human size. Percy glanced at his father, who nodded and shrunk as well. Zeus walked forward to stare into the hearth at the center of the hall, his face completely unreadable, though the lines of his body remained incredibly rigid and angry. Percy looked over at his father again, unsure of what to do, but Poseidon just shrugged and walked forward until he was a polite distance from Zeus. Percy joined him as well, waiting to see what would happen next. To his surprise, Zeus did not immediately begin talking but began to pace like some sort of caged animal, first this way then that before the hearth. After many minutes of pacing, it seemed that Zeus found the words he had seemingly been looking for. "As much as it galls me to admit it, you were a capable hero. Because of that, I wish you to oversee my son's journey. If you let him be slain, I will scatter you across the deepest part of Tartarus. Succeed and you may cleanse some of your misdeeds from my consideration." Poseidon grew angry now at Zeus' words, his eyes betraying the depth of the emotion though his face remained largely impassive. "You dare to threaten my son? You forget your place, brother," Zeus snapped. "He is no longer simply your son. He is a god now, and therefore I am his king." This did nothing to dispel Poseidon's rage. In fact, it only increased it. Percy could feel the air in the room grow heavy as Poseidon's power grew with his anger. Percy too was angry, with the situation, with Zeus, with fate, with everything, and he felt his power beginning to affect the air in the room. Percy knew he had to do something or this would only worsen. He prayed to Hestia out of habit while taking a huge breath to try and bring his unruly emotions under control before stepping forward and speaking. "Lord Zeus, what would you have me do?" Percy's pride was clamoring to rebel as he always had, but a voice that reminded him so much of Annabeth it hurt, was telling him to not be stupid. He faced his uncle doing his best to hide his own emotions and not let them color his words, otherwise he risked saying something that would end in his needing to reform for gods only knew how long, or worse. "My son must free his oracle from the serpent as he once did. It will not be that simple, but if he manages it he will earn his godhood back." Percy had been frustrated before, but it had been controllable. Unfortunately, Percy knew the story of Apollo slaying Python and it finally pushed him past his limit. He had tried to keep his cool and hear Zeus out, but this was too familiar. "You mean if Apollo manages to survive while I kill Python for him and keep Apollo from dying, or I have my physical form scattered across Tartarus?" Percy's words dripped with sarcasm and a tinge of derision. What happened to the ancient laws forbidding direct interference? Or is that just a convenient excuse for you? Perseus. "No, Dad. I'm sick of being the god's plaything. I might be new to this, but..." Percy was just getting going, but Zeus interrupted. "I will ignore your disrespect this once because..." Poseidon interrupted his brother in turn, "because 2/3 of the council would be against you doing anything drastic to our greatest hero." Zeus ground his teeth in anger before continuing his words. "You will see that my son survives, you will see the serpent defeated, and you will see the oracle retaken for Olympus. However, you are only allowed to intervene if Apollo and his companions are up against something that sought them out, because Apollo is a god. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir. I have one condition." Percy kept talking, ignoring the scoff of anger Zeus loosed. "I will do this only on the condition that you honor a promise you made to me when I was 16. Both Poseidon and Zeus looked at him confused. They had kept the promises they had made to Percy. There were no unclaimed, no abandoned demigods anymore. Percy shook his head and sighed. "In your defense, I forgot about her too. I am going to keep a promise to another friend. Free Calypso from her prison and I will gladly see Apollo to the end of this trial." Percy was surprised that he had survived the day before given the meeting and his rather demanding request. Especially considering a part of him, the part which was usually the part that got him in trouble at school, had kind of wondered just how hard Zeus could hit him. Just like before, the other voice in his head had piped up telling him not to be stupid. Percy couldn't help but laugh at the horrible irony of the experience. Here he was not only alive but a god, finally listening to his common sense, and his common sense sounded like the person he had loved more than life itself, but she was dead. Percy was sitting on the porch looking out over what he thought was one of the Great Lakes. He had asked Athena to help him get the view to randomly shift every day or so to a different beach for variety. He relented. Percy spun to face the person who had spoken. He had been expecting his father and had not sensed anyone approaching, so finding Artemis standing there was a surprise, to say the least. He gave her a questioning look, unsure of how to respond to her statement. "My father," he relented. "The Titaness will be freed on the condition you are responsible for her. If she goes astray, my father will hold you accountable." Percy swallowed dryly before speaking. "I suppose that's fair. No offense, my lady, but why are you bringing me this news, not my father or Hermes?" Artemis smiled at him, a real smile, and considered him for a long moment. "Calypso may have been an enemy in the past, but she is a worthy maiden and you have acted more honorably than any man in my memory. That is worthy of recognition, and it reinforces my belief that giving you Moonsteel was the correct decision. I wanted to thank you for being an example for the young men and women whom you now find yourself, patron. Even my huntresses respect you. You are a good man, Perseus, do not change. My lady, may I ask a favor of you? Will you offer Calypso a place in your hunt? I am sure she will need a home, and I'm sure that seeing me is not high on her priority list." Artemis regarded him for a long moment, then without speaking she nodded. She disappeared as silently as she had arrived, seeming to vanish into a moonbeam that flashed silver for a moment out of the sky. Percy looked back out over the water, considering her words. especially those immediately before she left. He felt like they could be taken as a request or a warning. He stared out over the water, losing track of time. Soon enough, however, his solace was interrupted again. He felt Hermes approaching and called out to him, "I can tell it's you, Hermes." "Awesome, Percy, that's great, but not why I'm here. I'm supposed to take you to Aegigaya." "No, Hermes, Artemis is going to take care of it. Thank you for offering to help me, but I just can't." Hermes sat next to him, looking out over the water, his eyes unfocused and distant. "I understand, Percy, better than you might realize. I will do whatever I can to make your task easier. We both know Apollo is going to be an absolute pain in the neck, and that's not even including all the complications that will arise, as they always do when you're involved." Percy considered Hermes and everything that surely lay before him. The pain in Hermes' voice struck a chord within him, and with a shock, he realized this would be his first adventure, ever really, without Annabeth as his guide. Even when he was going to rescue her, she was his motivation to keep going. She was his rock, and now he was adrift. As he thought about his lost friends, he fell into memory. Battle raged around him. The seven were fighting the giants alongside their parents. Even as Percy whirled through the battle like he always did, he heard a chilling scream. He spun and saw Hazel's jacket on fire. She ripped it off and seemed to be scrabbling with a pocket, the firewood. Percy willed water to rise from the soil, from anywhere, but it was too late. A bright flare of fire, and Percy heard another gasp of pain. Frank Jong had returned to human form and collapsed to his knees. Percy was still locked in combat as he tried to get to his friends, but it was too late. He felt more than saw Frank finally fall to the ground, never to rise again. He heard Hazel's choked sob, but that too was cut short. Percy disengaged, or he tried to, but even as he threw off the momentary lock he found himself in, he found Hazel, and his eyes widened in horror. Thune stood over her triumphant, his massive cleaver stained with blood. Hazel had collapsed to the ground, and Percy knew she was dead. He joined Hades in assaulting the giant, leaving his father for the moment. With Percy's help, Hades was able to subdue the giant, at which point the fates began to pummel him with clubs until he was nearly unrecognizable. Percy stepped forward and locked his now misshapen head from his shoulders. His sense of loss growing, but it was being outstripped by the growing rage that threatened to once again lose control of himself and his power. The fighting continued, and Percy rejoined his father in taking on Ephialtes and Otis. They would have been outclassed by the sea god and Percy at the best of times. But now, with Percy's pain filling him with a battle rage so unlike his normal demeanor, they stood no chance. Even as they fell, however, another pain scream tore at Percy's heart. This time it was Jason. He was holding Piper's limp body in his arms. She had been thrown across the battlefield and slammed into the ground, rolling until she came to a stop, broken at Jason's feet. To Percy's horror, it was Porphyrin who had thrown her, and Jason lowered her to the ground before charging to meet the giant born to kill his father. Percy raced across the battlefield to join in the fight. The two of them were able to hold off the king of the giants temporarily, but it seemed their luck was running out. Percy heard an odd wet crunching noise, and he turned to face it. Jason was standing next to him with a javelin impaling him. He had clearly taken the missile in order to protect Percy. Everything was going wrong. Only 3 of the 7 remained on their feet to continue the fight, and there were still only 4 dead giants. Percy began to fight his way to Annabeth's side, dodging massive spears and limbs alike. Eventually, he managed to press himself back to back with Annabeth, taking comfort from the contact. "Percy, in case we don't survive this, I love you, and I always will." "Don't talk like that," Percy growled as he deflected another blow from Enceladus, who it seemed had managed to find Annabeth amongst the confusion. "I love you too, wise girl, but we're gonna make it through this." Percy stopped mid-sentence. A feeling like a cold chill swept over him. It reminded him of the feeling on the bridge when Annabeth had stopped a knife from striking his mortal point. Percy lunged to his left and deflected yet another blow from Polybotes that was intended for Annabeth, but the chill didn't fade, and Percy watched as Leo was crushed under the fist of a giant Percy didn't recognize. He returned his attention to Polybotes, and with his father's help they slew the giant born as their opposite. Then the world slowed, and he was turning back towards Annabeth. Even as he began to shout a warning, a giant's spear impaled her from behind, the sick irony being that it struck her exactly where his mortal point had once been. Annabeth dropped to her knees, her eyes beginning to dim, but she found his face, and though he couldn't hear her, he saw the words she said as plain as day. "I love you, seaweed brain." Percy raced towards her, his throat loosing a scream of pain and unbridled loss that even over the sounds of battle echoed across the hilltop. His path was blocked by another giant, and Percy felt the sensation he had felt in Tartarus once more, but this time his wise girl wasn't here to beg him to stop. He didn't care if he lived or died anymore, just that he slew every single giant that had taken his friends from him. He became a whirlwind of death, his powers pushing him beyond the limits of anything he would have been capable of normally. Now every giant he faced seemed to be slowed, as though their own bodies fought against them. He fought and fought until one after the other the giants fell. He stood panting, still primed for the next blow, when something dropped onto his shoulder. Poseidon's trident intercepted riptide less than 3 inches from Apollo's wrist. Percy looked around and found his father's face set in a mournful expression. Percy spun and raced towards where Annabeth had fallen. He dropped to his knees, and much as Jason had, lifted Annabeth's broken form, holding her to his chest, tears rolling down his face as he rocked her back and forth for a moment. His rage began to return, however. He had one more being to battle before this was over. He lowered Annabeth gently to the ground and closed her eyes. Getting to his feet, he faced the gods. "I don't care how. Get me to Camp Half-Blood." Percy blinked several times to clear the tears that had gathered in the corners of his eyes, but they had not fallen. He met Hermes' gaze again and saw his own grief and loss mirrored there. Percy was once again reminded that despite his appearance and his outwardly good-natured behavior, Hermes had lost many times as many people as Percy had ever known. The one thing he could not relate to was Tartarus, and the memory of that place was the only thing that rivaled his loss for presence in his nightmares. "You know, I was thinking about proposing," Percy asked rhetorically, as there was no way Hermes could have known. "I had even talked to Leo about making a ring." Hermes stayed quiet for a long time, and Percy was in no rush to talk. His pain welled up anew, and it felt like it was filling his throat, making it hard to breathe, or even think properly. Percy swallowed hard, refusing to lose control of himself. He needed to be strong, as he always had to be. The other campers, the legionaries, his quest mates, all of them had depended on him, on his power. He had failed them, and yet here he sat in a palace that belonged to him on Mount Olympus. Percy refused to let his exterior crack, because if he did, he didn't know if he would ever put himself back together again. "I'm sorry, Percy. I truly am." Percy believed him. He had never blamed Hermes for his fate, and Hermes had only ever helped him over the years. The gnawing pain that filled his heart was almost numbing. He felt so little else outside of the terrible emptiness that he felt like a shell of himself. He had lost so much, so many people, and it never seemed to end. "I promised her that we were going to get out of this. That we would survive." Even as he said it, a lance of pain shot through his mind like a hot knife, searing through him. At the same time, a sound like a summer gale seemed to fill his ears. Words, some whispered and soft, others bellowed and harsh, seemed to overlap in the sound. He clutched his head, feeling like it was splitting apart with the noise and a terrible sense of awareness he couldn't comprehend. Yet Hermes reacted immediately and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Percy, are you all right? Can you hear me?" Even as Hermes finished talking, however, he went rigid and pale. At the same time, a god's lifetime worth of promises kept and promises broken raced through Percy's mind. He saw and heard every single one, big or small. It seemed that Hermes was in far worse shape, and Percy knew why. Hermes was being forced to relive every broken promise, especially that which weighed most heavily on his conscience, a promise he made to May Castellan. Even as Percy fought to free Hermes from his visions of his past, Percy was still having to contend with all the other voices in his head. Every single voice seemed to be trying to gain his attention, though for what reason Percy couldn't say. It only took a handful of seconds to wrestle this new power under his control and separate it into its own stream of his consciousness, but it was a long handful of seconds. Even after Hermes was freed from its influence, he was pale and shaken. "I'm sorry, Hermes. I couldn't. I wasn't." "It's okay, Percy, you didn't break the promises. I did." Hermes took a long while to compose himself, and Percy sat trying to figure out what happened, and how to keep it from happening again. "Do you trust me to take a look inside your head for a moment? I need your permission, as you're a god now too." Percy saw no reason to mistrust Hermes, so he nodded in agreement and bowed his head forward. To Percy, it looked as though Hermes was steeling himself to poke around in his head, which wasn't the most reassuring thing he had seen since becoming a god. "Do me a favor and keep whatever that was under control." Hermes placed a hand on his temple, then Percy felt a presence flitting through his mind for a few moments. It lingered on the boundaries between his now 4 consciousness streams. One for each of his bodies and one containing the new sense. Hermes withdrew his hand and it felt like the presence slipped out of his head as smoothly as it had appeared. "Well, it's been a while since I've been in a god's mind, but yours is remarkably simple. No offense, but it shouldn't be surprising to me, or you for that matter. Your presence is not being invoked at an ever-changing number of locations like mine or Dionysus, which means you have fewer consciousness streams. That's beside the point. However, I think this new sense is related to your loyalty domain. I can't say for certain, but it seems as though any and all promises made, kept, broken, and otherwise are now a part of you." "What exactly does that mean?" Percy asked, slightly dreading the answer. "Well, if I'm right, then it seems as though Olympus finally has its own oathkeeper. I'm sure you're aware of the implications of oaths on the Styx. It seems to me that a part of your domain of loyalty will be the enforcement of promises of all kinds." "Well, that's my best guess anyway." When Hermes had said oathkeeper, he felt a thrill of some emotion he couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear or anger, not good or bad really. It felt just right to him, and he was sure Hermes was right. How he knew, Percy had no clue, but perhaps that was just part of the gig. It was his domain, after all. It just felt right. Hermes stayed for a while longer, talking to Percy about what it had been like when he had first really come into his domains. It was a different experience, as he had been born a god, so they were more naturally a part of him as opposed to Percy, who was having to adapt to his new powers. Percy was grateful for the company because it kept his mind off of recent events, at least for a little while. Eventually, however, there was an interruption in the form of a knock on the door, and Percy once again felt absolutely nothing. "Come in, Artemis," Percy called over his shoulder, swiveling so he was not facing away from the goddess as she approached the pair of them sitting on the edge of his palace's rear deck. "My brother has reached the camp. He will soon begin training, as none at the camp are allowed to know his true identity save Chiron." Percy nodded. He had actually been aware of Apollo's arrival at camp due to his aspect that was patrolling the borders of the camp. Artemis continued, and he detected a change in her tone that seemed to be out of character for her, at least recently when she talked to him. "My father gave me a message to relay." She seemed to be annoyed at being used as a messenger, but continued, "You will see that his training in the sword goes well. Maybe he can show you a thing or two in other areas." Percy blushed slightly. It was well known he was worse than incapable with the bow. Being reminded of that now stung slightly, but he was used to it by now. Percy realized Artemis was holding out a bow to him. He took it and felt his powers activate slightly. Looking down at the bow, he slowly became aware that it was now familiar to him, as if he had been using it all his life. He held the bow out to her and she took it back, looking slightly confused. "This is a bow worthy of my brother's skill, though not nearly as powerful as the original. It is for him, not you." Percy grinned and focused on his power. With a flash of sea green light, a perfect copy of the bow now rested in his open hands. It was identical to the bow that Artemis once again held. From limb to string, it was a perfect copy. Both Hermes and Artemis looked genuinely surprised, despite the fact that Hermes had helped Percy train his powers. Artemis was completely unaware, however, and for the first time since he had taken the sky from her when he was only 13, she seemed to be considering him more shrewdly. "How did you?" "Part of my being the god of weaponry. If you hand me an arrow, I might be able to replicate that too. So far it's only been weapons that I've spent a good amount of time getting to know that I can replicate. Guess there's more to it. Kinda neat, right?" Hermes had stepped forward and was examining the replica with interest. He had seen Percy summon weapons a few times, but they had been simple or very familiar. While practicing with Apollo and Hermes, he had even managed to summon a weapon while they were sparring, though it took so much concentration that against an enemy that was actually a threat to him, it would likely not end well. "Well, I guess this means that your connection with the domain is growing stronger. Maybe you will be able to do even more in the future. I am curious how you managed to copy something you'd never seen before." Percy shrugged before responding, I guess my powers must allow me to sort of skip that whole familiarizing myself with it step. As soon as I touched the bow it was like I had spent days examining it. Artemis didn't immediately respond but instead withdrew 2 arrows from her own quiver and handed them to him. He took them and felt his powers once again activate on contact with the arrows. He handed the originals back and created a copy of each, one in each hand. After replacing the originals back in her quiver she reached out towards one of the arrows before stopping short. May I? She asked. When he nodded with a surprised look on his face at her question she gently lifted the arrow and examined it. She looked at the arrow impressed and without waiting she took the other one. She reacted much the same as with the first one then looked up at him. You may not realize the significance of what just occurred so I will explain. One of these arrows is made of moon steel and is dipped in a paralytic poison found only in a rare monster that I hunted over 300 years ago and it has yet to reform. The other is made of celestial bronze and I have imbued it with a small amount of my divine power. Despite you having no knowledge of this, both replicas carry these properties as well. You do not simply recreate the physical object, that is extraordinary. I will have to discuss this with Athena. Percy paled slightly but shrugged realizing he needed to get used to them all eventually. I won't replicate them anymore my lady. Artemis looked at him and cocked her head slightly. I knew you were different when you took the sky from my shoulders Perseus. You would willingly choose not to recreate a weapon because you feel you shouldn't. Only a selfless hero would relinquish the glory of the battle against Atlas himself in order to free me and hold the sky. At the time I thought perhaps it was because of your age, that you had not yet grown into the arrogance of men. Yet that is not so it seems. She paused and her eyes seemed to shimmer slightly. You gave up godhood once, you relinquished the praetorship of Rome, and you fell into Tartarus. Not the actions of a selfish man. I suspect as well that if you were completely honest your reasons for accepting godhood were far from selfish as well. If you had your way you would have been the only hero to fall in the final battle or am I mistaken? The frankness with which she said it sent a chill through Percy. She was right. Percy would gladly give every bit of his new power, his life, and his very soul if it meant his friends and family would have survived. That is true my lady. Percy thought he heard a noise from Hermes but he dismissed the thought and refocused on Artemis. I accepted godhood because... Percy trailed off as the aspect of him patrolling Camp Half-Blood sensed something familiar. My apologies my lady. There is a certain horned matter I need to take care of. Percy felt another familiar presence and his anger grew. Before Artemis or Hermes could say anything more he snapped his fingers and rejoined the portion of himself that was facing 2 of his old foes, the Minotaur and a Manticore he knew as Dr. Thorn. Percy was being held still by something. He couldn't even turn his head to see his surroundings. Before him was a familiar building, the building where his mom and Paul lived. It was one of the only places he truly felt at home. The next moment he was in their apartment but despite his horror he couldn't scream, he still couldn't move even an inch. On the living room floor before him lay his mom and Paul, or rather their bodies were laying on the floor. Sightless eyes gazed at the ceiling. Even from where Percy was frozen he could tell their chests did not rise and fall. It's just a dream, it's just a dream, snap out of it Percy. It was a desperate plea to the world that he wasn't even sure he believed. His dreams had always been more prophetic than many other demigods. His worst fears were confirmed a moment later as blood began to flow from them and formed a familiar face on the kitchen floor where Percy was rooted in place, an unwilling observer. Oh little hero, I will teach you that disobeying me has consequences. I do not appreciate your actions on the earth or below it. Your mortal parents died believing that you were lost to Tartarus. Percy felt the dream shift slightly and he found that he could move a tiny bit, enough to struggle and enough to speak. You did. It can't be real. You're just lying. You want me to abandon the quest. You won't get me to back off that easily Gia. How mistaken you are little hero. I want you and your little girlfriend as my sacrifices. You will bring me back to consciousness. I do not wish for you to abandon your quest at all little hero. Know what you see before you is the truth. If you do not believe me you know how to prove it to yourself. With these words, Percy felt the force that bound him in place release and he sat bolt upright in his bunk aboard the Argo II. He sprinted to the mess heedless of his surroundings. When he reached the mess, he snatched up a goblet, willing it to fill with plain water. He waved his hand, conjuring a mist from the liquid and tossing a golden drachma into it, asking Fleecy to show him his mother. To his dismay, nothing happened. He asked again, and this time the mist shimmered slightly and he heard a voice in his head that he recognized from Iris' shop on his way to Alaska. "I'm sorry, Percy. I can't." It seemed the fates had something of a sense of irony. That he was facing the Minotaur here of all places seemed like a very bad joke. Dr. Thorn, however, was a different story. He was much more intelligent than his horned companion and would be more of a challenge. Percy grinned and spun his ring, riptide flashing into view as a blur of gray bronze metal before it settled comfortably in his hand. He began to move the tip in small circles, keeping his wrist moving so he was prepared for immediate action. As it had at West Overhaul, there was a blur of motion as Dr. Thorn's tail launched a volley of spikes at him. When he had been 13, he hadn't been fast enough to keep track of the tail, the spikes, and everything else going on. Now 5 years later, and with the ascension to godhood on his side, he was ready for whatever Thorn would throw at him. What he wasn't prepared for was for it to feel as though Thorn may as well have been another camper throwing knives at him. He sliced them all in half with a single stroke, the pieces spinning off to land in the grass. In that moment of surprise, Percy realized just how much becoming a god had changed him. He knew he would need to be careful or he would fall into the same trap that had allowed him to best Ares when he was only 12 years old. Thorn snarled and began to throw more spikes at him, trying to limit his movements as the Minotaur began to charge him, lowering his horned head as he got nearer to Percy. Against a mortal demigod, it would have been a nearly flawless plan, the threat of the Minotaur splitting attention from the flying spikes, and in turn, those spikes would have hampered his movement. However, Percy was no longer a demigod, he was much more than that. Focusing his new power, he summoned a simple dory, the long spear appearing just as he spun riptide to return it to ring form. He caught the spear and in one fluid motion launched it at Thorn. The spear had never been a weapon he practiced often, so he wasn't surprised when the spear missed where he had been aiming, though slamming into Thorn's shoulder was close enough. The blow threw off Thorn's aim enough that Percy was able to dodge the Minotaur's charge in time. Much as he had when he was 12, he misjudged the timing and the Minotaur's nails raked across his side, tearing his shirt and the skin beneath. Lines of ichor began to run down his side. Hissing with frustration at himself more than anything, he lunged towards the staggered Thorn, ramming his shoulder into the monster, sending him sprawling, and his landing wrenched the spear still embedded within his shoulder. Percy spun his ring and finished Thorn off quickly before having to leap sideways to avoid the Minotaur again. "Okay, beefhead. Wanna have some fun? It'll be just like old times." The Minotaur bellowed its challenge at the top of its lungs. It rolled across the hills and echoed in the shallow valley that held Camp Half-Blood. It snorted angrily and shook its head before its attention was diverted. Percy saw its nose twitch and it snorted again. Percy wasn't sure what was happening until a handful of arrows seemed to appear in the Minotaur's left side. It bellowed again and broke the shafts with a sweep of its arm. They snapped like toothpicks and it seemed as though they had only pissed the hulking creature off more. Percy decided he was done playing around. Pouring godly energy into his sword like Apollo had taught him, he took 3 long strides to build speed, then leapt at the Minotaur. The monster only realized his danger when riptide, glowing with a green-blue nimbus of light, sank to the hilt in its chest. It let out the beginning of a strangled groan before it exploded violently into dust on the wind. "Well, that is certainly a way to introduce yourself to new campers." Percy turned at the sound of Chiron's voice, which sounded completely unconcerned and even sounded as though he was amused by the situation. There were 7 campers with him, all holding bows. It looked to Percy like Chiron had brought his archery class along to see what was going on at the border. Looking closer, he realized that they must be younger Apollo campers, and among them Apollo himself, though he couldn't refer to him as that. What was his human name again? Larry? Leroy? Percy pondered, trying to remember. His thoughts were interrupted once again by Chiron. "My apologies, my lord. Campers meet Lord Perseus, the patron of heroes, the god of the tide, loyalty, and weaponry. He is also the 15th Olympian." It appeared that 3 of the campers aside from Apollo knew who he was and were more familiar with him. The other three were clearly very new to this as their eyes widened and looked from Chiron to Percy and back a couple of times. Percy laughed at their expressions and walked over, falling into step next to Chiron as they walked back towards the archery range. "Hey guys, don't be worried, I won't smite you or anything like that, and I told you not to call me Lord, didn't I, Chiron? It just feels wrong." Percy could hear the campers talking nervously to each other behind them as they walked. It seemed the more experienced campers were relating his story to the other three. As soon as Percy realized this, he purposefully tuned them out. The last thing he needed was another flashback right now. Soon enough they reached the archery range and Percy stood next to Chiron watching as the campers began their practice. "How's he doing?" Percy asked Chiron in an undertone so the others wouldn't hear him. "Well enough, but he is frustrated by the mortal limits on his abilities. Watch him shoot." Percy turned to focus on Apollo now. Watching him shoot, he might as well have been back in class trying to learn algebra. He had no idea what to look for as a good or bad sign, so instead, he looked for Apollo's target. To his surprise, Apollo's arrows, while compared to mortals or other demigods who were not his children, he would have been considered exceptional, but compared to even this younger group he wasn't even middle of the pack. The only camper that seemed to be doing worse than him couldn't have been more than 11 years old. "Larus, you're letting off on the draw just before your release. Use your back to hold the weight of the draw, not just your arms." Larus. That was Apollo's cover name. Percy couldn't help but smirk to himself. Hermes had been incredibly amused by the name choice, though he hadn't enlightened Percy as to why. Even from here, Percy could see the flush of color that crept into Apollo's neck and cheeks at the advice. It seemed to help his shooting, which only served to worsen his embarrassment. "Chiron, I'm going to be around camp a bit more for a while. Mind if I get involved with sword training? Also, is there anything new I should know about?" Chiron's tail flicked nervously before he made a noise, and he took a long while after he took a breath to exhale and answer. "I have no issues with it, my lord, though Clarus will likely take issue with it. Also, my lord, you may know already, but Ms. Dare is unable to sense the spirit of Delphi." Percy nodded a few times, smiling wryly about the first comment. "Well, that's to be expected from her. Also, yes. I did already know about that. It's part of why I am here. I have been tasked with ensuring whoever you send to fix the issue succeeds. Lord Zeus expects." Before Chiron could finish speaking, thunder boomed overhead and Percy saw Chiron's eyes flick upward. "Not here then? I'll see you at dinner, Lord Perseus. We will talk afterward." After once again good-naturedly chastising Chiron for the title, Percy left and walked over to the sword-fighting arena. As he approached, he could hear the swishing of blades and the heavy breathing of demigods drilling hard with their weapons. Above the cacophony, Percy could hear a familiar voice shouting cadence at the top of her lungs. Percy entered the arena and sat in the back of the bleachers so as not to draw attention immediately away from the lesson. Examining his side, he was glad to see the shallow grooves from the Minotaur's nails were already healed, and it took little to clean the ichor from his clothes and repair his shirt. Now that he was done examining himself, he started to watch the class, a sense of nostalgia coming over him as Clarice had stopped the drilling to demonstrate a new technique they would be practicing before adding to the drilled sequence. Live demonstrations against an opponent tend to get the point across better. Percy couldn't resist messing with Clarice, and this was the perfect opportunity. She turned and was clearly holding herself back. "Greetings, Lord Perseus." Percy rolled his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose exasperatedly. Glancing around again, Percy realized he couldn't tell what cabin was surrounding them. "So care to have a spar, Clarice? Also, what cabin is this?" Now it was Clarice's turn to roll her eyes and look exasperated. "We changed the way the classes are structured. Now attendance is based on proficiency, not just a schedule." Percy nodded and saw the wisdom in the change. Moving back slightly, he spun the ring and riptide appeared in his hand once more. He could hear a few impressed people in the crowd and tried to ignore it as he saw Clarice sizing him up. She called out instructions and the class filed into the stands, clearing the arena before drawing her own blade, tossing the practice sword she had been using for demonstrations in the dirt. Percy noticed she didn't toss it very far and knew he'd want to keep an eye on it so Clarice couldn't surprise him with it during the fight. They took up fighting stances and waited, both of them bouncing slightly on the balls of their feet. Clarice struck first, a quick jab at his hip followed by an overhead cut that she changed the target of at the last second. Percy deflected both with deft flicks of his own sword, sending Clarice's blade wide of his body without breaking her equilibrium. She narrowed her eyes at him before growling in annoyance. She began to rain innumerable blows on his guard. Her overwhelming offense would have soon exhausted most opponents. Her years of training and conditioning in addition to her father's blood allowed her to maintain a blistering speed for much longer, without sacrificing accuracy and control, than most would have been able to contend with. Before, Percy and Clarice had sparred relatively often, with him winning just over half their duels, much to Clarice's frustration, but now every stroke, every thrust, every move she made was met with his sword and an iron wrist. Her heaviest blows he warded off with relative ease, and after almost 2 minutes of defensive fighting, Percy decided to go on the offensive. After a particularly heavy side cut aimed at his hip, rather than simply deflecting the blow, Percy stepped back and let it hiss through the space he had just occupied. After so long dealing with Percy's parries and deflections, Clarice was surprised by the change but recovered, just in time. Now it was Percy's turn to weave a net of bronze about his opponent. His varying and ever-changing style coupled with his new strength meant that Clarice was barely keeping up. Percy began to press harder until he finally saw an opening and used the first sword technique he had ever learned. His sword slid along the length of hers before meeting her hilt. He twisted their blades and then pushed the tip of his sword down. Clarice's blade hit the dirt with a muted thud and Percy stepped back, returning riptide to ring form. "Well, I suppose I shouldn't really be surprised," Clarice muttered as she stooped to pick up her fallen blade, which made Percy smile even wider. "You did great, Clarice. Was this like old times? You probably would have had me today, especially if you had been able to get a hold of the practice sword like you planned." Clarice laughed, her scowl of disappointment fading somewhat, though Percy knew she would still be annoyed about it for some time. "I was wondering, would you mind if I take over sword training lessons? At least for the newest fighters." Clarice looked at him shrewdly, her eyes slightly narrowed, and he thought she was going to say something when they were overrun by the campers who had rushed from the stands. The cacophony of voices asking questions meant any further conversation was out of the question, so they both turned and began answering questions, making slow motion demonstrations of moves and finishing the rest of the lesson Clarice had planned. By the time they were, the conch horn was sounding in the distance, signaling dinner. The various cabins represented in the class began to break away from each other and rejoin the rest of their cabin mates heading to the pavilion. Clarice took her place amongst the Aries bunch. Percy watched them all for another minute, then snapped his fingers and appeared at the head table next to Chiron. "Well, how'd it go?" Chiron asked, and again Percy thought he could hear the amusement in his voice. "Better than I expected." After Percy disappeared, Artemis left his palace. She understood where he had gone and would have been more surprised if he had simply done nothing. As she walked the distance from his palace to her own, she was deep in thought. Percy had asked her to take Calypso in, and give her a home, but Artemis had a suspicion that the Titaness would not be taking the oath. Sighing to herself, Artemis stopped walking and focused on Aegygia. She found herself there moments later, her feet sinking slightly into the soft sand beach. The sun was bright overhead and it warmed her whole body. She may have been the goddess of the moon, but even she had to admit there was something immensely comforting about the warmth of the sun. Delaying the inevitable wouldn't help anyone, so she made her way towards the center of the island. She found Calypso at a table eating a midday meal under the shade of a low awning in her garden. At the sight of her, Calypso stiffened, her eyes darting towards the other exits to the garden. Artemis sighed again and stopped walking. "What can I do for you, my lady?" Calypso's voice was calm and even, betraying none of the anger and frustration she no doubt felt. "I have come for 2 reasons at the request of another. First, I will be returning you to Olympus with me, and second, I am offering you a place with my hunt." To say Calypso looked surprised would have been an understatement. Her eyes widened and her lips parted slightly as though she was going to ask a question. Then her expression grew guarded and she snapped her mouth shut. "Why are you being cruel, my lady? What have I done to deserve this?" Artemis knew she should have expected this. She sat across from Calypso and pondered how to respond. The truth simply stated, it seemed, would be the best option. I am not lying to you, Calypso. One of our greatest heroes has ascended to godhood. As a part of an agreement he made with my father, a promise we Olympians made almost 2 years ago is now being honored. That is why you are being freed, and that is why I am offering you a place with my hunt. The hero I speak of thought that my hunt could be a home for you. He believes that you will not be eager to see him again. As she spoke, the look on Calypso's face once more returned to surprise and disbelief. However, at her final words, Artemis could see tears gather in the corners of her almond-shaped eyes. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, Calypso asked the question Artemis knew she would. Percy. Artemis nodded and took a moment to allow Calypso to process the information. He is a good man. The offer of my hunt still stands. Calypso looked up at her, surprised for an entirely different reason now. Artemis had referred to Percy as a good man, and she knew Calypso would understand the significance of that comment. I'm sorry, my lady. I cannot join your hunt. And why is that? Artemis asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. You would have a home, sisters to keep you company, and more. Calypso blushed slightly and would not meet Artemis' eyes. Ah. So Perseus was mistaken in his guess then. Calypso looked up at her, surprised that the goddess didn't sound annoyed or disappointed in the fact. Yes, my lady. Calypso cast her eyes downwards. I still love him. He was the greatest hero I have had forced to care for by fate, and now you tell me he is the reason for my freedom? How could he think I would not want to see him? I think we both know the answer to that last question, Calypso. There is not a prideful bone in his body, and unless I am wrong, I imagine when he was here he would have been surprised by you falling for him in the first place. My lieutenant tells me he is clueless and completely incompetent with girls. For the record, my lieutenant is his cousin Talia. Do not mistake her words for what they are not. She was also one of his former lover's best friends. At these words, Calypso's head snapped upward. Former lover. Calypso's voice was timid and unsure. What happened to her? Perseus was one of 7 demigods who were tasked with defeating Gaia and the giants. In the end, all of the 7 were slain save Perseus. Annabeth had even survived the depths of Tartarus at Percy's side, but in the final battle against the giants on the Acropolis she was slain. We would have lost everything were it not for Perseus. He stood alongside the gods, alone, and helped us defeat the giants. Then we sent him back across the sea to Camp Half-Blood at his request. There he put an end to Gia's physical manifestation, scattering her consciousness once more. There were tears in Calypso's eyes, as much as it had hurt her that he had left her, that his heart had belonged to another. She truly loved him. Hearing about his loss pained her deeply. I didn't. I never wanted. Oh, Percy. Artemis had detected something in Calypso's voice that was more than just the sympathy of one who loves someone. It almost sounded like guilt. That thought brought only confusion. Calypso had been trapped on a magical island for over 4 millennia. There was no way she could be involved. Calypso? What do you mean? Fresh tears spilled down the Titaness's face as she looked up at Artemis. I cursed her. For being the reason he left. For being the reason he didn't stay here with me. I cursed her, and now she's dead. How can I ever even speak to him again? He won't be able to forgive me. Artemis was slightly taken aback. She had long experienced the various forms of the way loss of love affected women. Many in her hunt were victims of many of them, Zoe being the closest to her. This was different, and Artemis knew she was not the best person to handle the situation. Calypso. Not even the very wise can see all ends. Let me take you to Olympus. There are others who can handle this better than I can. I came because Perseus asked me to as a favor. I have made my offer. It is up to you to decide what to do after we reach Olympus, and talk with my uncle. Artemis stood and looked skyward. The sun had moved, but she knew better than to trust the input of her senses here of all places. Calypso, it seemed, had vanished. Artemis guessed it would be to gather her things, and she was proven correct. Several minutes later, Calypso returned with a large bag slung over her back and a large pot bearing moonlace. Her eyes were still downcast and her face was shadowed. Artemis shook her head and extended a hand to Calypso, who took it tentatively. Within the blink of an eye, they were gone, reappearing inside of a large room filled with comfortable furniture. The blue walls and wide back doors opened to a beautiful coastline, reminding Calypso of Percy. Remain here. I will return with my uncle. Where is here my lady, and which uncle? Calypso's voice shook slightly. Nervous energy seemed to fill her at the two options. Perseus' palace on Mount Olympus. Do not worry, it will be some time before he returns. Which uncle? Perseus' father, Poseidon. Canon changed for those that are confused. In this story, Leo never landed on Aegigea. That's why Frank was still vulnerable to fire in the battle against the giants and why the last hero Calypso healed was still Percy.